7 different alien governments sent personal messages to General Kane specifically, some formal, some surprisingly emotional, expressing gratitude that went beyond standard diplomatic language into something more genuine and harder to translate. One message from the leader of a small species called the Ethon, who had lost nearly a third of their population to a vector attack 60 years earlier, contained only one sentence in their native language. When Earth's translation systems processed, it came out as, "We had forgotten what safety felt like. Today we remembered." Kane read that message privately, alone in her office, late at night when the command center had quieted down. She read it 3 times. Then she set it down carefully on her desk and sat with it for a long while before returning to work. In the outer systems, far from Earth and far from the battlefield, the remnants of the Vector Empire's political structure were collapsing with a speed that surprised even humanity's most optimistic analysts. The Empire had been built entirely on the foundation of military supremacy, the absolute, unquestionable belief, shared by both the Vector themselves and every species they had ever encountered, that the Vector war fleet was the ultimate power in the galaxy, and that resistance against it was not just futile but genuinely inconceivable. That foundation had taken centuries to build. It took 89 seconds to destroy. Without it, everything built on top of it began to fall almost immediately. Planets that had been paying tribute to the Vector Empire stopped paying. Colonies that had been under Vector administration began organizing their own governments. Species that had been forcibly incorporated into the Empire's territory decades ago started the process of reclaiming their independence. Vector political leaders who had ruled their home systems with absolute confidence began receiving challenges to their authority from within their own populations. Challenges that, for the first time, they had no credible military threat to silence. The Vector people themselves, who had been told their entire lives that their empire was eternal and invincible, were processing the sudden discovery that neither of those things was true. It was, by any historical measure, one of the fastest political collapses ever recorded, and it happened almost entirely without further violence, because the violence had already made its point so completely that nobody needed it repeated. 3 days after the battle, the Vector home planet sent a formal communication to Earth. It was not from Supreme Commander Draax. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to Draax, since he had been on one of the ships that the Blue Wave erased, and there was nothing left to find. It was from the Vector Civilian Council, a governing body that had existed mostly in name only during the military empire's peak, but that was now rapidly becoming the only functional form of Vector government remaining. The message was long and carefully worded, moving through layers of formal diplomatic language before arriving at its essential point, which was that the Vector Civilian Council wished to discuss terms of permanent peace with humanity and was prepared to offer full reparations to every civilization the Vector Empire had harmed, to the extent that such reparations were possible given that many of those civilizations no longer existed. Kane read the message in full, then passed it to Earth's diplomatic division with a single handwritten note attached. The note said that the diplomatic team should handle all further communications with the Vector Civilian Council, that they should be thorough and fair and not punitive beyond what was genuinely necessary for justice, and that humanity's goal was a stable and lasting peace, not revenge, and not the replacement of one empire with another. The diplomatic team followed those instructions precisely, and the negotiations that followed, while long and complicated, eventually produced an agreement that most galactic observers considered genuinely just. 6 weeks after the battle, a journalist named Devon Osei requested a personal interview with General Kane. Osei was well known across Earth as one of the most respected and most direct journalists of his generation, a man who asked the questions other journalists avoided and who had a reputation for cutting through official language to find the human reality underneath it. Kane agreed to the interview without conditions, which surprised some of her staff, but Kane had always believed that the truth was easier to maintain than a carefully managed public image, and that belief had served her well throughout her career. Chapter. Interview took place in Kane's office, a plain room with no decorations except a single window that looked out over a mountain range. Osei sat across from Kane with a recorder between them and began with the question that every person on Earth, and most people across the galaxy, actually wanted answered. He asked her when she had known, with genuine certainty, that humanity would win. Kane considered the question for a moment with the same unhurried attention she gave to everything, and then she said something that Osei had not expected. She said that certainty was not something she had ever allowed herself during the preparation process, because certainty made you stop checking your work, and she had spent 30 years checking her work. What she had was not certainty, she said. What she had was confidence. Confidence built from evidence, from testing, from the thousands of engineers and scientists and soldiers who had given their best thinking and their hardest work to Project Erasure for 3 decades. She trusted them. She trusted the work. And trusting the work was as close to certainty as any honest person could get. Osei nodded slowly and then asked the follow-up question that the first answer had created. He said that many people assumed Project Erasure had been under development long before the Vector ultimatum arrived, that it must have been years, perhaps decades in the making. He asked Kane to confirm when development had actually begun. Kane said that the initial theoretical research had started approximately 32 years before the battle. Osei did the calculation quickly and said that 32 years ago, there had been no specific Vector threat to Earth, that the Empire had been active in distant parts of the galaxy at that time and had not yet shown direct interest in the solar system. He asked her why humanity had started building such a weapon that long before there was a specific enemy pointing at them. Kane looked at him for a moment before answering, and when she answered, her voice was quiet but completely clear. She said that 32 years ago, humanity's leaders had looked at what was happening in the wider galaxy, watched the Vector Empire moving systematically through star system after star system, watched civilizations disappear one by one, and had made a simple and honest assessment. The assessment was that the galaxy was not safe, that it had probably never been as safe as comfortable civilizations like to believe, and that the responsible thing to do was not to wait until the danger was close enough to see clearly before preparing for it. She said that the hardest part of that decision was not the engineering or the cost or the secrecy. The hardest part was the discipline of preparing seriously for something that had not happened yet and might not happen for a long time, of not allowing the absence of immediate threat to create the false impression that no threat existed. Osei sat with that answer for a moment and then asked his final question. He said that General Kane had now, between the battle itself and the broadcast that followed it, become probably the most recognized individual in the known galaxy. He asked her how that felt and whether she had thought about what came next. For her personally. Kane was quiet for slightly longer than usual before answering this one. Then she said that what came next for her personally was the same thing that had always come next: the work. She said there were 847 warships that needed to be properly maintained and appropriately staffed, 31 new alliance relationships that needed to be built carefully and honestly, a Vector peace negotiation that needed to be watched closely to make sure it produced genuine results rather than temporary ones, and approximately 40 other strategic priorities that her team had identified as requiring attention in the post-battle period. She said she expected to be quite busy for the foreseeable future, and she said it in a tone that made very clear she found the prospect entirely satisfying. Osei thanked her for her time and began gathering his things. Kane stood and shook his hand. As he was moving toward the door, he stopped and turned back, the way journalists sometimes do when a question arrives late and uninvited. He said that one more thing had been bothering him, something small, and he hoped she did not mind him asking. She told him to go ahead. He said that when the Vector ultimatum first arrived, that original 3-sentence message giving humanity 72 hours to surrender, there must have been a moment, however brief, when she felt the weight of it, when the scale of what was being asked and the scale of what refusing would require landed on her fully. He asked what that moment had been like. Kane thought about it genuinely, which Osei appreciated, because she could have given him a polished answer in 2 seconds, if she had wanted to. Instead, she looked out the window at the mountains for a while, and then she looked back at him and said that yes, there had been a moment like that. She said it had lasted about 4 seconds, long enough to feel the full weight of the situation, to understand clearly what was at stake and how many ways things could go wrong, to feel the specific loneliness of being the person in the room whose job it was to make the final call. She said that in those 4 seconds, she had thought about every person on Earth going about their lives without knowing what was coming, and she had thought about the 14 civilizations the Vector Empire had already destroyed, and she had thought about the 30 years of work sitting behind Jupiter waiting for exactly this moment. And then the 4 seconds were over, and she picked up the piece of paper and wrote the 4 words on it. And that was that. Osei asked what the 4 seconds had felt like. Kane said they had felt like 4 seconds. She said it without any irony or deflection. Just a straight, honest answer from someone who had learned a long time ago that the way to survive difficult moments was not to make them smaller than they were, but also not to make them larger, and to trust that 4 seconds of honest feeling was enough before the work began again. Months passed. The galaxy reorganized itself slowly and unevenly, the way galaxies always do after the thing that everyone had been organizing around suddenly disappears. New alliances formed. Old tensions that the vector threat had suppressed began to surface. In some places, while in other places the shared experience of having feared the same enemy created unexpected bonds between species that had previously had little reason to interact. Humanity found itself in a position it had not fully anticipated and was not entirely comfortable with. Not an empire, because Kane's broadcast had been genuine and her diplomatic team had worked hard to ensure that the new alliances were partnerships rather than hierarchies, but something that carried weight and responsibility in the galactic community in a way that could not simply be put down after a battle was won. Kane managed that responsibility the same way she managed everything, with consistent attention, genuine seriousness, and a complete absence of interest in performing it for anyone's benefit. She attended the alliance meetings. She read the reports. She made the decisions that needed to be made and delegated the ones that could be delegated. She pushed back firmly when she felt Earth's diplomatic team was being either too aggressive or too accommodating, and she was right often enough that people had learned to take her pushback seriously. She continued to live in the same modest quarters she had occupied before the battle. She did not give many interviews. She did not attend the various ceremonies and celebrations that different civilizations organized in humanity's honor, sending polished representatives in her place while she stayed at her desk working through the next item on a list that never seemed to get shorter. The 847 ships of Project Erasure remained active, properly maintained and fully staffed, their positions updated regularly and their readiness status checked on a strict schedule. Kane had made clear to every alliance partner and every potentially hostile empire that this would always be the case, that humanity's fleet was not a temporary response to a temporary threat, but a permanent feature of the galaxy's new reality, not a threat to anyone who chose peace, an absolute certainty for anyone who did not. 1 year after the battle, a small ceremony was held on Earth for the engineers and scientists and construction workers who had spent 30 years building Project Erasure in secret. Most of them were old now. Some had died before the battle ever happened, never knowing whether the thing they had spent their lives building would ever be used or whether it would simply float behind Jupiter forever as a monument to a threat that never arrived. The ones who were still alive came from all over Earth and stood together in a large hall and were thanked, genuinely and specifically and at length, by a government that finally had permission to say out loud what those people had done. Kane attended that ceremony. It was one of the very few public events she attended that year. She sat in the audience, not on the stage, and she listened to every speech and she applauded every name that was read. At the end of the ceremony, one of the senior engineers, a tiny, ancient woman named Dr. Hannah Yuan, who had led the propulsion team for the first 15 years of the project before her health had forced her to step back, made her way slowly across the room and found Kane and took both of her hands in her own small ones. Dr. Yuan looked up at her and said, in a voice that was old and quiet and entirely steady, that she was glad it had worked. Kane looked back at her and said that she was glad too. Then she said that Dr. Yuan and everyone who had worked on the project should know that whatever stability and safety the galaxy now had, Whatever peace was being built in the aftermath of everything that had happened, it had been made possible by 30 years of people like her showing up and doing the work even when the work felt abstract and the threat felt distant and the sacrifices felt enormous. Dr. Ewan nodded once, squeezed Kane's hands, and then let go and made her way back. Across the room, moving slowly, but with great dignity, Kane watched her go. Then she turned and walked back out into the world where the work was still waiting, as it always was, as it always would be. The war zone near Earth's solar system was empty now. It had been empty for a year. Ships passing through that region of space sometimes slowed down when their scanners showed them where it was. Not because there was anything to see, because there was nothing to see, which was precisely the point. Just open space, clean and quiet and vast. But everyone who traveled through that part of the galaxy knew what had happened there. The scanner records existed. The broadcast existed. The history was permanent and well documented and would remain so for as long as any civilization existed to remember it. Humanity had entered the war zone. The enemy was gone. And the galaxy was different now, not perfect, not without its complications and its tensions and its ongoing work, but genuinely, measurably, and perhaps permanently different. Because one species had spent 30 years preparing for a moment that took 89 seconds to arrive and had been ready when it did. The stars continued to burn. The planets continued to spin. And somewhere among them, 847 human warships moved quietly through space, patient and watchful and ready, in the way that only things built with 30 years of serious intention can be ready, completely and without any doubt at all. The end.